Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Wednesday, the 25th of June, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. We start off today's show with a quick in focus note here. I say Israel is almost certainly pressing for Iranian regime change, and a lot of people say, no duh. The Israeli Defense Force put out something on Monday that I thought was very interesting. So far, we have seen this Israel-Iran ceasefire agreement that was brokered by President Trump, and it does remain to be at least tenuously holding. Israeli forces almost certainly, however, continue pushing for Iranian regime change. We've seen comments like, this campaign is not over, and we'll get to that in just a second. And we've seen other officials say something to the effect that Mossad is never part of a ceasefire. And so the sentiment from Israeli officials that we have seen is that they will likely continue unconventional operations against the Iranian government. On Monday, the IDF confirmed that they had struck 5 security targets in Iran. Now, this is prior to the ceasefire, but you start looking at these targets of what they hit, or at least what they said they hit, and you get a very clear picture of what's going on. So first of all, they hit the remaining command centers of the IRGC. They also hit the headquarters of the Basij. Now, the Basij is interesting. They are Iran's domestic paramilitary security force. They put down the protests, and they kind of function as like almost an auxiliary, a security auxiliary. They go and investigate people for being disloyal to the Iranian regime. Anytime there's been a protest, they'll like ride around on motorcycles and whip people with chains. They're also armed. So this is like it's just the domestic security force, which is a volunteer force, and it's really paramilitary. So hitting the headquarters here, I think, is quite significant. They also hit another target which oversees security operations in Tehran. They hit the Thar Allah Command Center, which is responsible for organizing the defense of Tehran. They hit the Syed al-Shahada Corps, which is, quote, responsible for homeland defense and the suppression of internal unrest. And then they hit the GID, the General Intelligence Directorate, which, quote, supervises personnel within the internal security wing. So these strikes, and again, they happened prior to the ceasefire, but you start looking at what these targets were, and it's just very obvious that the strikes were intended to degrade Iran's internal security and almost certainly enable a domestic uprising or revolution against the Iranian government and the Ayatollah. So bottom line here is that Iran is almost certain to continue targeting the Iranian nuclear weapons program. We'll probably not seen the last of maybe even U.S. strikes against Iran, since President Trump is promising that they'll just be hit again once Iran resumes its nuclear weapons program, which I'm sure they will do. And then also, it's pretty clear Israel is going to continue shaping Iran's internal conditions for regime change. Israel has previously pursued this policy. They call it mowing the grass, and it's what they've done in Lebanon, and up until that October attack is what they were doing in Gaza and the West Bank. And they'll go into an area and they'll knock out some command and control and communications infrastructure. They'll hit a bunch of headquarters and targets and try to kill a bunch of fighters. And then the operation's over. They call that mowing the grass. I think Netanyahu has just been tired of mowing the grass. And I think we have seen the end of that policy in Gaza, which has been cleared out very obviously. When the head of Israel's military says the campaign is not over and we're going to pivot to Gaza, it's pretty clear. They're going to try to wrap Gaza up and then be able to focus their main effort again against Iran. So I think this is only a matter of time before something like this comes around again. Also, in terms of the ceasefire, I noticed Iran yesterday, they announced the reopening of their airspace. Israeli airline, commercial airliner El Al, also announced that they will resume flights into Tel Aviv. In terms of commercial air travel, it's a pretty good sign that the ceasefire is going to hold, at least in the interim, or at least that they expect the ceasefire to hold, at least in the interim. But I seriously doubt that Israel wants to continue mowing the grass on this Iranian nuclear weapons program. We've seen this guy, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He's the exiled crown prince. He's the son of the Shah. And he's been promising a return to Tehran. So I'll just end with this. I mean, this ceasefire, I think, has probably been fairly unpopular in Israel. And it may last for the interim, but this is not the end of what we've seen in Iran. And this will probably end with regime change in Iran. With that, let's go ahead and move on to our domestic sit rep. So Senate Majority Leader John Thun said that he quote unquote, feels good about the prospects of getting the big, beautiful bill through the Senate by the end of this week. And Robert, how close is this going to be to the House version of the big, beautiful bill?
Well, so far what I've seen, there have been some cuts of some things. I think the most recent one we talked about yesterday was cutting out some of those provisions that would have basically strengthened the Trump administration against the district courts. I did see yesterday that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that Republicans are getting near a deal on one of the key sticking points for this bill, which is the state and local tax deduction. There are Republicans in seats in blue states that are, I think, politically rely on this SALT deduction to get votes. So they're trying to figure out what the cap is going to be. I've seen somewhere between $10,000 and $40,000 cap on that. And then I did see there have been some more updates from the Senate parliamentarian has advanced some more things, or has allowed some more parts of this bill to go forward, including that SNAP cost share agreement, or that SNAP cost share requirement that the Trump administration is pushing, that would require states to cover between 5 and I think 25% of the SNAP costs from the federal government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just as a reminder, if a state has a payment error rate above 10%, so if greater than 10% of those SNAP payments, which is food stamps, if a greater share of 10% are made in error, then these states will be forced to pick up to, I think it's 25% of the SNAP funding, and they really don't like that, which, Robert, it really says to me they need to get a handle on their payment error rate so they can only pay 5% of SNAP. But I think it's fantastic. I think the Trump administration is going in the right direction. They've got to get these states some skin in the game, because otherwise the federal government when someone else is paying for your payment errors, you have no incentive to fix them. So, all right, thanks for that, Robert. Let's move on here to USDA. They are opening up, 59 million acres or something like that of federal forest land to new logging and mining projects. USDA says that this will reduce wildfire risk by allowing, apparently at the local level, what they say is common sense forest management and permitting the thinning and cutting of trees. Robert, we always talk about wildfires in the summer. California especially talks about, the National Guard mobilizations in Los Angeles are reducing our ability to fight wildfires. Well, it seems to me that if 59 million acres are now permitted for thinning and some, what they say again is common sense forest management at the local level, sure seems like the risk of wildfires will be reduced.
Yeah, I pay attention to some people out west who cover things like the forest management, and that has been one of the big obstacles they've talked about to actually preventing wildfires, like the one that ran through Los Angeles County this earlier this year, or late last year. And so that's one big obstacle, and the other one is the basically the Endangered Species Act is being used by the states to stop a lot of this logging and even just the normal forest management operation. So, basically a lot of these areas where the wildfires happen regularly, they're not being logged and they're not actually being maintained because of state level lawsuits from environmentalist groups.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then let's move on. House Speaker Mike Johnson, just briefly, he said this War Powers Act is unconstitutional. Does this really matter a hill of beans at this point, Robert?
Well, I think this is a signal that he's going to oppose. So right now there's this War Powers resolution that Democrats and a couple of Republicans are trying to bring to basically constrain the Trump administration from conducting any further strikes in Iran without a bill from Congress. And I think this is a signal from Johnson that he doesn't want the House to even bring this to the floor But this is also this issue, I think, is becoming another one of those areas of pressure against the Trump administration to, I think Johnson is right that this is within the president's Article 2 powers. Previous administrations have used the same authority since basically 1946 for every military conflict we've been in. And I think this is going to become another fight over the next 4 years where the Trump resistance is going to try to constrain the Trump administration from really doing anything.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on to this whistleblower over at the DOJ. These whistleblower says that the DOJ ordered lawyers to ignore the courts. I guess this is over the district court rulings.
Yeah, this is former DOJ lawyer Erez Ruveni. He was the lawyer that was fired over the Kilmar Obrego Garcia case when he went in front of the court and said that the Trump administration accidentally deported him. He did say in a whistleblower report on Monday that Emil Bove, who's a DOJ official, ordered the Department of Justice lawyers to ignore the court's orders that were blocking the Trump administration from using the Alien Enemies Act. And he said that another DOJ official also told him to avoid using email communications with other agency lawyers after he reached out to them. And he was terminated in April after that case. And I think the first obvious point here is that this whistleblower complaint is dropped earlier this week, right before Emil Bove is supposed to be in a confirmation hearing, I think today, because he is actually a nominee for the federal appeals courts from Trump. But I do think that while I have doubts about the specific whistleblower case, I do think the Trump administration has been kind of pushing the boundaries quietly on these district court orders. But I doubt that a DOJ official would have just openly in a meeting with every DOJ lawyer just told them to ignore the courts openly.
Mm-hmm. All right. Before we get to this denaturalization case, let's just go ahead and cover this. In New York, the Muslim socialist Mumen Dini did beat Cuomo in this New York City mayor's Democratic primary. So he will go on to the election. When is that election? I guess it's next year.
Yeah, the November 2026 general election.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I have seen a number of people in the Trump orbit say that Mumen Dini has been a citizen for 7 years, and he has promoted socialist revolutions. And I've seen a number of people say, if you go back into, I guess, some of the naturalization, basically, if you promote revolution, if you're a naturalized U.S. citizen and then you promote revolution, you could have your citizenship revoked, which I want to go back to this denaturalization. A, what's going on? And B, is this a case where the Trump administration wants to start denaturalizing U.S. citizens of their citizenship?
So this is an internal memo that was issued on the 11th. And I didn't see anything in it that talked about any specific cases like Mumen Dini. Like this was issued before the primary, the New York City mayoral primary was decided yesterday. So I don't think this was specifically talking about that. But in there, they did tell the DOJ civil division lawyers to prioritize and, quote, maximally pursue denaturalization proceedings in all cases where where it's permitted by law and where they have enough evidence. Which basically, to me, looks like the Trump administration is going to start pursuing cases of revoking citizenship, recent citizenship, and I think specifically in cases where they can find any kind of fraud was committed by an immigrant who managed to get citizenship.
Mm-hmm. All right, and this is obviously going to be another case that gets tied up in the court. Is this I imagine this will eventually make its way up to the Supreme Court. It may be a while, 18, 24 months, who knows? But ultimately, what do you see the Supreme Court doing with this?
Well, I think by law, at least in like the cases you mentioned with if a recently naturalized citizen espouses like communist revolution, I think in that case it's pretty clear statutorily the president, the administration has the power to start those kind of proceedings. I think the Supreme Court, based on that decision we covered yesterday, at least the conservative majority is starting to really have stronger opinions about how these district courts are basically hamstringing the administration. And I think as these cases continue to go on, we might see the Supreme Court start to come on Trump's side a lot more than they have been in the first couple of months.
Mm-hmm. Just by the way, in terms of protests, I can see Indivisible building another National Day of Protest / National Day of Action / National Day of Resistance around this particular issue, and it seems to me like that's pretty good contender for the fall, probably. All right. Thanks for that. And then let's also hit this East Coast heat wave briefly. Go ahead.
So, yeah, yesterday, PJM Interconnection, they ordered some of the utilities on their grid to start cutting power to customers using these voluntary reduction programs. And this is because of the high temperatures. They're going over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and they were actually overheating transmission lines and were causing some gas turbine power plants to have to lower energy production. Also, New York's grid operator, they're called the New York Independent System Operator, they put out a warning that they were going to have to start using emergency measures because they were seeing declining operational power reserves. And then ISO New England also issued what they call a power caution, and they're saying this is because they had a loss of power generation resources on their grid. As we've covered over the last 2 years, New England has been, the Northeast has been one of the main regions of the United States that have been closing down these fossil fuel power plants, and they're saying there was not enough baseload power generation to both maintain demand and their required reserve margins.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is something that you started talking about 2 years ago. Last year, I did this whole big presentation on the coming power shortages, which have now started. And one of the big things is you look at, I'll have to go back and find that graph, but you look at declining reserve power margins. And in many cases, these grid operators and the power plants just do not have the additional capacity to ramp up to meet demand. And we are seeing that now. By the way, you can thank Obama's Clean Power Plan 1.0 and Biden's Clean Power Plan 2.0 for this. If you are a residential customer that has a planned outage because of this, Robert, any other points here before we move on?
Yeah, on the clean power plans, I think what's important to understand about that is even though they have been or are in the process of being reversed, and then the previous one was reversed, just the threat of implementing those plans does have an impact on grid security, because these utilities anticipate that it's going to come into effect, so they start retiring power plants early, and that's what we saw with these coal-fired power plants, and which required the Trump administration to start issuing these emergency orders to keep them online. I think the last one we covered, that power plant was actually expected to go offline by the end of this month.
Mm-hmm. And it's only June, so we still have 2 more months of this probably. Greg says up here in Cleveland, or up there in Cleveland, over 40,000 people have been without power for 2 days. Robert, by the way, let's talk about Pennsylvania. Have you seen, there were, I think in 2 weeks now, there have been fires at 2, I'm not sure if they're power plants or if they're power substations, but it has knocked out power to a lot of people in Pennsylvania. And someone brought it up on the early warning chat yesterday. I've not looked into it. A, have you seen it? And B, does this look like a case of intentional sabotage? Like someone's going and starting fires at these substations?
I didn't see that specific case. It's not impossible. I mean, we did have that spate of the sabotage against power plants in 2023. Mm-hmm. But I think looking at the California case, I think it's also, I would lean towards just maybe a naturally occurring fire due to high temperatures. Because like in the California case, there were these wildfires started around this power infrastructure. Part of it was that the transmission lines were being knocked down, and and a major problem with all of these grids is that the maintenance around the transmission lines has basically been lax for years. So they're getting they get overgrowth around these transmission lines, and high wind hits, and a tree knocks down a transmission line, and a fire starts. So I think I would lean towards that until I look further into this.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, great point. Corey dropped it in the chat. He says 2 substations out 20 miles apart, 1 day apart in Pennsylvania. I think they're probably blaming high temperatures for the fires, but we'll see. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to our global sit rep. I already covered this first item. El Al said they're flying back into Tel Aviv. Iran said they're reopened their airspace, and it looks like this ceasefire is going to hold again for the interim. I think Israel's obviously pretty over the long term intent on regime change, so the ceasefire will end eventually. All right, Jared, let's go ahead and move on here. So Trump said, somewhat curiously, he said he's going to allow China to buy Iranian oil. China's already been buying Iranian oil, and I saw some White House official came out and said this, even though Trump said that, this does not reflect an actual change in policy. So what's the latest here?
Yes, so it was a fairly simple social media post. Hey, China can buy oil now, and that has been the big question: is what does this do for policy change? Haven't seen that yet, but this does actually kind of knock something that I've been saying here for a while, that all the sanctions on the buyers of Iranian oil have also been affecting China's ability to refill its strategic petroleum reserve. Being that that's a major strategic goal, prevent China from being able to wage a war with its SPR. I don't see how they would take that away. That they'd probably find a new way to keep identifying and targeting these teapot refineries that we've covered quite a bit. So I will be keeping an eye on this and seeing how it changes the layout.
All right, moving on here. Foreign Minister in the UK, David Lammy, announced that they're increasing their intelligence budget by about $800 million after a government finding showed that Chinese spying is on the rise. Many such cases. Also staying in the UK, there's the new national security strategy was published, and apparently that strategy warns that the country needs to, quote unquote, actively prepare for warfare in the homeland. And they're talking about predominantly guarding against cyber attacks, against energy and supply chains. The UK is also going to implement a new home defense program that includes annual national defense exercises. And so looking a little more serious there. Moving down to Mexico. Mexico recorded a 1.5% decline in economic activity for April. That is year over year. And that has slowed annualized economic growth to just 0.1%. So Mexico here has narrowly avoided a technical recession after they had also posted negative growth in the fourth quarter of last year. Also in Mexico, they've been doing this thing called Operation Northern Border, and Mexican authorities are reporting that they have destroyed 48 clandestine drug labs, seized 8 tons of drugs, and arrested over 1,200 criminals over the past 15 days as a part of Operation Northern Border. Since the beginning of the Trump administration, they have let's see, when did this go back? Yeah, since the beginning of the Trump administration. They've arrested over 4,000 criminals, destroyed over 1,100, almost 1,200 drug labs, and, that's since October of 2024. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum also said that nearly 60,000 Mexican nationals have been deported back to Mexico, and an additional almost 6,000 third country foreigners have been deported to Mexico since the beginning of the Trump administration. Moving back over to China, Jared, they are vowing retaliation for the Taiwan chip curb. What's the latest?
Absolutely. So Taiwan last week, they announced that they would no longer be sending any kind of technology to Huawei or China's semiconductor manufacturing and industrial company, the SMIC. Now, China's Taiwan Affairs Office, which is their main liaison to Taiwan, promised forceful measures to safeguard the normal order of cross-strait economic and trade exchange. And they, despite the massive differences, the mainland China and Taiwan do actually have a lot of trade. But the Taiwanese curb on specifically plant construction technologies is actually to hinder China's ability to stay competitive in the AI race. That's why China's taking this as seriously as they are.
Sure. All right, and then let's look at this forward staged ammo plant. This is something that Congress and the DOD and Department of State are looking at. So what's the latest?
Yes, this is coming from Congress, ordering the DOD, Department of State, and the International Development Finance Corporation to jointly assess the feasibility of reestablishing an ammunition manufacturing and storage facility at former U.S. Naval Base Subic Bay in the Philippines, which you can see here. That's not too terribly far from Manila as well, and it's right in prime operating area. Now, the ammo manufacturing plant is also intended to be a joint U.S.-Philippine operation in order to facilitate the Philippines modernization program as well. So I think there's a very good chance that this is going to go forward. You're going to see funding from both sides. Both sides want to get this done because the Philippines will just use a lot of this ammo as well as, the United States here.
Sure. And we've actually seen quite a bit of this over the past several years. U.S. defense planners talking about restarting their participation or restarting forward-basing operations, essentially, in the Philippines. Subic Bay, and there's a couple of other ones, but do you recall which of these? My dad was deployed to one back in the early '80s. Which Philippine bases are those?
So I don't remember all the names. I know on the same main island, Luzon, where Subic Bay is, running all the way up to near Taiwan, there were 5 additional bases that were reactivated, giving us leasing opportunities, and the Navy's also leasing facilities around Subic Bay, totally separate from this ammo storage and manufacturing plant. There's planning to do that already, and we covered that the Marines have a joint operation right near Subic Bay, if not in it, that they're running with the Filipino Marines for basically the same thing. They're not supposed to have weapons there, but we'll see. That said, yes, there's one of the things I think I'm going to do here is take a look at what all shut down over the last 30 years in the Pacific and target that, because that's exactly what they're doing here. They're looking at U.S. Naval Base Subic Bay and going, hey, we want that to come back. We want all this manufacturing stuff that we had over there to come back. So the prime target, I think we're going to see a resurgence of all those things that we shut down. Just, all right, let's demothball those, get them started back up, because we need to kill tyranny of distance by just having everything on station.
Excellent point. All right, moving on. We do have 88 protests for today. That's above baseline, but the baseline has been ticking up. And again, most of these protests are going to be very small. Some of these protests may not even happen in the first place, but we are tracking 88 of them today. And with that, Robert, let's go ahead and talk about this leaked DIA report. So yesterday, CNN reported that based on people with firsthand knowledge of this top secret assessment, where DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, said that the strikes did not destroy some of these nuclear facilities in Iran. And they also assessed that these strikes only set back Iran's nuclear weapons program by months. I don't think anyone is seriously saying that these were the nuclear weapons program was completely destroyed, because there are too many loose ends here. And a lot of people came out and said, well, this is CNN fake news. And then the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, came out and said, well, no, this actually is a top secret assessment that was leaked to CNN, or the details were leaked to CNN. So it can't be fake news and a leaked top secret assessment. Why don't you catch us up on the details, because SecDef has given us an update here. What is that update?
Yeah, this was at the NATO meeting yesterday. Hegseth said that this DIA report, he effectively confirmed that it the leak is real. And he said, though, that it's only a preliminary assessment with low confidence. And he did say the FBI is investigating the leak of that classified assessment. I think they did. Trump and Hegseth both said that this was basically a political move, which is possible. I mean, we had that CIA analyst last year leak the plans, the assessment of Israel's plans to strike Iran for pro-Iran or anti-Israel sentiment. And it's possible this was also leaked. Whoever did leak the details of this were also politically motivated. However, I think it's also possible that this preliminary assessment is wrong, and later battle damage assessments will find that they were more successful. The strikes were more successful in curtailing the Iranian nuclear program. But if this initial assessment does turn out to be accurate, I think this means the timeline for Iran restarting their attempts to obtain nuclear capability is likely measured in months rather than years.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the case. So there was a former Trump official. He was a retired Marine Corps officer. Then he went to CIA. He was a paramilitary operations officer for a number of years. And then he was in the Trump administration. I think he was over at the DOD, Defense Department. And he came out and said, kind of best case scenario, he said 2 to 5 years max. And we've heard a lot of different estimates. We've also heard from Israeli intelligence. They came out and apparently they said they're kind of shocked by this DIA assessment because it was so, apparently Israelis at least say publicly that more damage was done than what DIA is letting on here. And I would just add, this is, like you said, this is preliminary. They said they have low confidence, and it's really difficult to do an accurate battle damage assessment when you're reliant on imagery and relying on SIGINT. So when you're trying to listen into the Iranians or doing some kind of electronic exploits, getting into computers and looking at their communications about what was damaged and how bad it was, because my understanding is EMET and SIGINT are the two primary factors that led to this assessment. So anything else to update us here on, Robert?
No, that's it. That's the last comment on it I've seen was from Hegseth yesterday.
All right. Then we'll move on here to the Blue State Coalition suing Trump over grant cuts. What's going on?
So yesterday, 21 Democrat-controlled states and Washington, D.C. filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration. And they're claiming that the White House unlawfully invoked federal regulations under the Office of Management and Budget to start cutting what are called state revolving funds to the states. And they said in this lawsuit that they called it a slash and burn campaign, is depriving states of critical funding for state services. I think the bottom line up front is this lawsuit is more evidence that states have come to rely heavily on these state revolving funds to fund even basic services, which means that these spending cuts that the Trump administration is pushing through is not only going to negatively impact some of the subsidies and entitlement spending that we've seen states start to roll back, but could have a significant impact on just basic state service funding. And I think this is bad news for the Western states, especially because we've been covering the water security issues out there in the Colorado River Basin. And the EPA's Director Lee Zeldin came out yesterday after the Western Governors Conference and said that some of these state revolving funds focused on water programs are also going to be cut. I think he said something like 90% of them. And did, I think, signal that Congress needs to pass a specific bill to fund those Western water programs. So I think if this continues to go through, I think in the long term, this is another sign that we've been talking about for a while, that the states are going to start politically bifurcating into coalitions. So we'll see more red state, blue state coalition activity. But I think this is a bad sign for state level budgets, especially because they have now admitted that they are relying significantly on federal money just for basic state services. And then now with the water situation out west, I think this is going to be a major hurdle for those upcoming Colorado River Basin negotiations that I think are due up. The next agreement is due next year.
Mm. Robert, this is like the third or fourth indicator that I've seen that shows the Trump administration. I'm not sure at what level this is deliberate, but the Trump administration is going after these state budgets, forcing these states to pay for really kind of their own kind of critical infrastructure, their own critical state level operations, paying for that themselves rather than taking it out of federal coffers. And at some level, you just have to wonder, is this a deliberate effort to get these primarily Democratic run states to stop funding some of these asinine social programs because they've got to cut money somewhere, cut out the social justice warrior payments at the state level so that they can just run state level operations? I mean, it seems like that would be in line with what I expect from like a Project 2025 type of effort here. What's your opinion?
Yeah, I that is the goal. This is if he's able to win in the courts on this. This is probably going to be very effective at doing that. In some of these states that have started to roll back the healthcare subsidies for illegal immigrants, for example, are also looking at other programs and rolling it back. I know California had they've been pushing for the last more than a year for AI regulation at the state level. I think they even rolled that back just due to the costs of actually implementing that regulation. So the states are looking at other programs to start pulling money back because they're seeing these huge deficits come back. And it's not just California, as we covered yesterday. It's Maryland and even a couple of red states they're having to deal with these between $300 and $900 million spending deficits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. By the way, we haven't even touched the state pension deficits yet, and they are all underwater. They're going to need a federal bailout probably. Maybe when this next debt crisis hits. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on here. All right. So, Jared, let's talk about this. At this NATO summit, the NATO Secretary General came out and said pretty openly that he expects that China would attempt to pull Russia into a conflict. And basically, he said, again, this was at the day one of the NATO summit, which was yesterday. He said that Chinese President Xi Jinping will, quote unquote, no doubt call on Russia to, quote, keep us busy here. And he's talking about in Europe when China decides to move on Taiwan. He also said that NATO allies Japan and South Korea are, quote, very, very worried about the massive military buildup in China that at the moment is taking place. Additionally, Mark Root pointed out that just a few years ago, none of the top 10 defense contractors in the world were Chinese. And he said now somewhere between 3, maybe up to 5 out of the top 10 defense contractors in the world are Chinese. So this is a pretty big change from where we were just maybe even 5 years ago. There's been a lot of speculation about when China moves on Taiwan, this will obviously probably turn into a much larger regional conflict in the Indo-Pacific. Here, Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, saying this is going to turn into a two-theater conflict as Russia gets involved in Europe. And I would just add, over the past few weeks, we've heard from a Polish intelligence official anonymously and a German intelligence official anonymously. They both say they expect Russian President Vladimir Putin to instigate some sort of crisis, maybe even a limited scale invasion into a NATO country to test Article 5. And I'm just telling you what they say, so don't attack the messenger. But what they say is that Putin does not believe Article 5 is going to be invoked by the entirety of NATO. And this is just what they say. So being that the Secretary General of NATO is now kind of talking about this, how do you see this playing out, Jared?
I think his sentiment is correct. China definitely wants Russia to get involved. You can see on the map here that would pretty much tie up Japan and South Korea, which the United States also needs to be involved. And they, at least Japan, I'm confident, will be involved immediately. South Korea is a little bit up in the air right now. But that, even though it would also tie them up, the Russian Pacific Fleet is basically localized to Vladivostok. So they wouldn't, if they are immediately involved, they would not be involved for very long. And you can target basically everybody and shut them into their port. And if they leave, you kill them. They're kind of pigeonholed. They're surrounded by allies there.
Well, this is the big problem of Russian naval power is it is split among 3 different bodies of water, and it's very difficult for them to amass force. So given that, Jared, it would seem that Russia's hope here is to hang on to Vladivostok and instead push their operations predominantly towards Europe.
Yes. Now, on that note, I think to the extent that Russia and Europe would be involved in a Pacific fight, it would be far more economically and just material support, not military support, because both of them, they have their forces. First off, they're security threats to each other, so they have to keep the bulk of their forces next to each other, 8,000 miles away. But also, it's hard for them to get all the way over there. Russia, the quickest way for Russia to do it is seasonally dependent. They have to go through the Arctic. That's extremely difficult to do unless you're going to send a couple of subs, and a couple of subs are great, but not decisive. Now, so Europe's primary role in the conflict, I think, will be just to deny China a secondary export market, because it's pretty well assumed at this point that if China and the US go to war over Taiwan, we're not getting Chinese exports, or at least they're severely hindered. China would need an export market in order to maintain its cash flow. Europe is the next best candidate. Europe needs to shut them off. Russia's primary role, they don't really have the economic capacity, I don't think, to make that up, but they have an enormous industrial capacity that is very cooperative with China. They have extremely similar technologies. Most of China's technology is Russian derived anyways. So I think they use their industrial capacity to bolster China's magazine depth, which would pretty much that would require Russia to be done with the Ukraine war at that point. And on that note, I don't think Russia's likely to expand its war in Europe unless it was certain, not pretty certain, but absolutely certain, that NATO would not invoke the Mutual Self-Defense Treaty, because it would have to use its industrial capacity to support its main ally, China.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a fair point. And, I mean, I remember even prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there were some doubts that all of NATO would respond to an invocation of Article 5. I mean, we see from Spain pushing back, and again, it's Spain, but still they're pushing back and saying, we're not going to raise our defense spending to 5%. And a number of other countries also, that's just going to be infeasible, politically infeasible, and fiscally infeasible for them as well, probably. So, all right. Anything else you want to add onto that, Jared? If not, we'll move to the questions. I think we got one more item. Go ahead.
Yep, one more item, and then just one last point. Like, even if Russia were to expand the war, its main targets of opportunity in NATO are either the Baltic states, which are not critically important, Finland, or Poland. And Poland is going to be much tougher than Ukraine.
Yeah, I don't see Russia invading Poland. The Baltic, a 24, 48-hour race to Tallinn. Yeah, I'm sure I can see that.
Yeah.
All right. And then let's also go on and talk about the end of these dual carrier operations. This is something several weeks ago you pointed out. China actually has 2 carriers now on the east side of Taiwan. And catch us up to speed on that, Jared.
Yes. So the end of the deployment, these carriers are both returned at least to Chinese waters, if not home port at this point. The Liaoning carrier strike group, the older one, they spent 25 days at sea, and that was actually the longer term. The Shandong, which is the newer carrier strike group, spent only 16 days out here. Now, keeping in mind, over the last couple of weeks, we've done some pretty important reporting on this. They did hit several distance and operational milestones. Cannot fault them for that. That they did a good job on that. But there were only a maximum, and I'm very loosely using this to count this, a maximum of 7 possible days that they even conducted joint operations of any kind between the carriers. And the nature of those operations currently remain obscure. Now, China, I think, will almost certainly continue practicing dual carrier operations out in this area. They have to, just to enhance its naval competency, because it has to get used to, okay, how do I run multiple carrier strike groups? They're not even really used to how do I run one. So they have to actually get their competency up, and they have to increase their endurance. 25 days is not enough time for them to run basically anything, because you can just wait that out. Taiwan could wait that out. And then the blockade is, able to be directly attacked. They have to keep running these and get used to being out at sea considerably longer. And so I expect them to go and do that.
Mm-hmm. All right. So just to clarify here, this was their very first dual carrier deployment, correct?
Yes.
Okay. It lasted a little over 3 weeks, and maybe only 7 days of those there were joint operations. So very short duration deployment. Ultimately, how long should these deployments, if we're looking at this as an indicator that China is achieving operational confidence that they can go and conduct a military blockade of Taiwan, not an amphibious invasion, but just a blockade. How long would you expect these deployments to be until they reach a point where China says, okay, we've done this for X number of days or months, and now we're confident that we can go do this, not just in an exercise, but in actual combat conditions?
Well, so 6 months, not the very least, 6 months bare minimum. And the reason I say that is our deep dive into what does China require for a blockade time. Like we determined they need at least 6 months of SPR in order to run a blockade, because China or Taiwan likely can last that long. And these are defense pickets. They're pushing that line out. So not just around the blockade, but run it in the Philippine Sea there. You push it out a little bit more, make it harder for the U.S. carrier strike group that would have to interdict to get there, and then push out past Guam. You have to basically meet them out near Guam. It adds several thousand, I think it's like about 2,000 miles extra distance to stop the U.S. carrier strike group from getting in there and actually breaking that blockade. So they need to last potentially 6 months, minimum 6 months. I would say potentially up to a year, but that's probably going to involve actual rotations at that point. If you're talking about that kind of length, you really need to have more carrier strike groups than the 3 they have.
Mm-hmm. All right. So just looking at this again as an early warning indicator, let's put a timeline on this. So they need to run, and we'll just say this is our key assumption for this. They need to run this would have to be dual carrier operations, or could they just do this with one?
You could probably do it with one to allow for a rotation, but if I was doing this, I'd want to.
All right. So they need, just again, the key assumption, they need at least 6 months of endurance trials effectively to simulate carrier operations against Taiwan during a military blockade. How many months do you think it will be before they start that 6 month deployment? Again, if that's our key assumption that it will happen. And you can ballpark it. I'm not.
Yeah, I would say we're looking at probably. It looks like they're in a training cycle to me, just based on the fact that they go do these short deployments, practice things, and then go back home. That to me looks kind of like what we did with Comp2X, which composite unit exercise, where pre-deployment we go practice some things. And it was short, but it was, designed to go do it to actually conduct the mission. The problem is that China doesn't have any endurance training to back it up, where the U.S. Navy can run short ones. So allowing for getting back home, allowing for leave, and for maintenance, you're probably looking at a 3 to 6 month time frame. I'd say probably the earliest to the end of that 6 month training is 9 months from now. But that's the absolute earliest. You do need to have a maintenance cycle in there. Mm-hmm. And 3 months for a maintenance cycle is very slim.
Okay, so let's say best case scenario for China, in 9 months, they'll be at the tail end of the 6 month endurance deployment. And so that would still put them on track for a 2027 X date for a military blockade.
Yes, keeping in mind that that's a sample size of 1. You have done it one time. Mm-hmm. The Chinese have no problem pushing their people past probably the breaking point. But that means the Chinese Navy has only ever done it in peacetime one time, and they then have to go to war. I would not want to go with that level of preparation. Straight up, would not want to do that. I would want at least one more cycle, probably 2.
Mm-hmm. So do you think this pours cold water on this theory that China will have some sort of premature military operation here when they're not ready to do it?
I think so. It also, yes, I don't think China will start it. That doesn't mean that there could not be one that's initiated by other people. If Taiwan, we've been covering, they have been getting very open by just saying we are a sovereign nation repeatedly. That is technically a red line for China. I have to wonder at what point do they just go, okay, we have to move. Like, you guys just have to be pressed. We'll run with a, less of a picket than we intended, but we have to do it. It really depends on, since China doesn't get the only vote, there's a lot of it. There are a lot of variables in there to consider. And I'm obviously keeping an eye on Taiwan. What kind of red lines do they plan to cross here?
Mm-hmm. All right. Very interesting. Thanks for that, Jared. And we do have some questions that we'll get to. Much shorter question Q&A time today, since we went so long on the regular brief. Jared, if you can tee up maybe the best few questions here. What's the over-under on the ceasefire just being a convenient way to rearm Israel's air defense, like Iron Dome? My career intel brain tells me this will only end in U.S.-Israel-backed coup. I think the ceasefire is intended to allow Israel to finish in Gaza, or to seriously wrap up their Gaza operations so that they can pivot back to Iran. This is not the end of it. This ceasefire, it could last for months. It could last for days. Obviously, we don't know. But I fully expect Israel to pivot back to Iran, and I agree. I think this does end in regime change. I think Israel's tired of mowing the grass here, like they got tired of mowing the grass in Gaza. I guess this is in relation to Mumen Dini, who won the Democrat primary for New York City mayoral race.
Yeah,
did he have citizenship, or was this a permanent residency? He's been a citizen. I think I saw 7 years. I don't know how accurate that is.
Yeah, I think 2018 is the date that's been put out.
Okay. They have stripped the provision of the big, beautiful bill to prohibit illegals from receiving SNAP benefits. Also, the provision to withhold federal funds to sanctuary states. Do you think the House or Senate will, put them back in? So if I understand this correctly, in the Senate version of this bill, illegals will be allowed to receive federal SNAP benefits. Is that?
Yeah, that was the status quo, and a lot of it is because of during the Biden administration they did these. Basically, what they did with the one CBP app was allow them to apply for asylum hearings, and then that basically automatically came with a work permit, and there's an entire network of like legal nonprofits and NGOs that effectively collate all of this information and hand it out to them, saying, here's how you apply, and this is how you qualify for not even just SNAP, things like federal rent assistance through the Housing and Urban Development, cash benefits as well. And as far as if the House is going to put it back in, I don't think so. I think the House, they're trying to get this passed by July 4th, and before they go on recess. And the Senate's going to try to get this through by Saturday, basically, so that the House can vote on it. I don't think they're going to have enough time to add things in. So I think the House is basically going to take what they can get from the Senate and try to pass it as fast as possible.
So under President Trump's big, beautiful bill, illegals will still be getting SNAP benefits.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think what's going on in the Senate is there's a lot of horse trading over some of these, and there's also the parliamentarian is basically just an advisory position. So the Senate could overrule, but I think they see that as an extraordinary step. And in some of these, they just don't think that's a high priority. And there's also, I think, with this cost sharing with the SNAP benefits, if they do, I think they kind of expect that to be an incentive for the states to start cutting on their own end, allowing illegal immigrants to apply for SNAP benefits and other entitlements.
All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Next question is Doomberg. By the way, I'm a big Doomberg fan. He recently stated, by the way, I saw this video. I didn't watch it, but it's in my queue to watch. But Doomberg recently said that Russian and Chinese media are saying the world is already in World War III. To what extent is that assessment of Russian and or Chinese reporting accurate? I would say it's fairly accurate. I think the Chinese, Jared, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Chinese for several years now, at least since 2022, have been warning that the United States is reengaging in Cold War diplomacy and bloc mentality. And in official Chinese, I mean, just from like the foreign ministry, we see it, they're pretty clear that they at least say the United States is instigating this bloc mentality and increasing the risk of war through these, what China calls unilateral actions. And then, I haven't seen, I'm sure Medvedev has repeatedly warned about this because that's what he does. But he's been warning about the risk of nuclear war since 2022 at the very minimum. You follow China more closely than I do, but would you say that this is an accurate assessment that China believes that we're already in World War III, or Russia does?
China, I don't think they would say World War III. They would say they are at least at severe risk of war. That said, they're for a very long time, they've basically considered themselves to be at war anyway.
Oh, sure.
But that's following the unrestricted warfare doctrine of, hey, basically anything can be used, so we will use anything, and we don't have a formal declaration of war, but we're just degrading our enemies because we intend to have this fight eventually. Or at least, produce a fait accompli.
All right. What conditions would have to exist for the U.S. to re-engage Iran in combat operations in the near term? How likely is this? Well, we've seen from Trump officials that they are going to attempt to negotiate some restrictions on Iranian nuclear research. Obviously, nuclear weapons development is a red line. I would say it's pretty high. Very high likelihood that either Israel and or the United States strikes Iran if they believe that Iran has resumed nuclear weapons development or trying to get this highly enriched uranium at 60% up to 90%. I would say that's almost certainly going to happen. Trump has been very clear about kind of this carrot and stick. We'll negotiate with Iran. I would also say, I think at this point, Iran has to understand that they're looking at regime change. So that may have if Iran believes, and again, you get into rational actor theory or irrational actor, right? Not that Iran is obligated to act in its own best interests, the Iranian leadership. And a lot of times what we in the West, what we in the United States especially look at as irrational could be rational for Iranian leadership. But I would expect at this point, Iran has to understand that obviously regime change is on the table. And if they continue to pursue building nuclear weapons, or at least even have the appearance of building nuclear weapons, then they will be hit again. And again, my key assumption for the very beginning is eventually that Iran is going to regime change Iran. You look at this on Monday, IDF came out and said, well, we hit these 5 or 6 targets, and they were all domestic security targets. The besieged headquarters, hitting the command and control elements and communications elements for the defense of Tehran, hitting headquarters of military units essentially tasked with the defense of Tehran. It is obviously they're trying to degrade the internal security of Iran in anticipation for an uprising or a revolution. That is extremely clear. If the ceasefire didn't go into effect, I would fully expect that Iran would have continued to do that overtly. They're just going to have to do it covertly now through Mossad, because I've seen a bunch of people say ceasefires don't apply to Mossad. And so I think that unconventional campaign is obviously going to continue. I think the Israelis have pretty openly telegraphed that without explicitly saying that, but I think it's very clear that's what's going to happen. All right, last question here. If Iran feels like an existential threat to the regime, that would be the chance to go for a dirty bomb, since they may not have a nuke, but already have a delivery platform. A lot of this stuff goes back to this brand of Shia Islam that's practiced by Iran. They are waiting for what they call the 12th Imam or the hidden Imam. And they believe that, at least according to everything I've read, they believe that one of the reasons why they're pursuing a nuclear weapon, there's lots of reasons. Number one, leaders with nuclear buttons typically don't get regime changed. So I think that's one reason why they want a nuclear weapon, is because you basically have an insurance policy against regime change. Also, it allows the Iranian leadership to feel powerful. Power is extremely important in that part of the world, especially when you have a very long history, like 1,000+ years of history of wars with your neighbor, going back to 800 or 600 AD or something like that. So, so I think that's another reason why Iran wants a nuclear weapon, because power is important, and that would make them powerful. But back to this brand of, back to their eschatology, their kind of end times eschatology. They believe that they can essentially force the 12th Imam to return. This is the Mahdi. Okay, this is why, like, the Jaysh al-Mahdi, and that's why there's all these different Shia militia groups that have something to do with the Mahdi, because they believe that they will go fight on the side of this 12th Imam, the Mahdi, when he returns. And they believe that if they can cause unstable conditions, if they can cause chaos, that they can hasten the return of the Mahdi. And the Mahdi comes back, and the Mahdi fights against tyranny and injustice on behalf of the Shia brand of Islam. And so that's another reason why they want a nuclear weapon. At least the theory goes. That's one reason why they want a nuclear weapon, to hasten the return of the Mahdi. So this is, I mean, I would describe it kind of like as cult-like behavior. So it's very difficult. So this is the reason why some people in the West especially say Iran is doing something that's irrational, what may be very rational for them based on their beliefs. And it's something we typically don't understand very well in the West, because we have these Americanized lenses, at any rate. The chances for a dirty bomb, I mean, I think a radiological weapon, I mean, that's always going to be a risk. And I don't know. I don't think Iran would be satisfied with a dirty bomb. I think they want big, beautiful nuclear weapons. That's going to do it for today's morning briefing. We appreciate your support. Everyone, have a great rest of your day. We'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.